Hello everyone. In this presentation, we are going to look at how to teach speaking to young learners. We'll explore what involves in the teaching of speaking skills and what are the characteristics of students so that we can capitalize on them. It must be noted that we are not teaching them speaking as such. We are not teaching them how to speak. Rather, we are facilitating their process of acquisition. So, speaking and young learners, children really want to communicate, and this is how they've acquired their first language. They weren't intentionally learning a language, rather, they were trying to communicate with their mothers or their carers. And we can observe on babies that speech emerges when the child is ready. We can also observe that children are really creative and imaginative because they've worked out how language works for them. They have done it with their first language and they can also do it with their second language. Authentic materials for children can be really helpful. We can engage them with those materials like songs, games, and stories. They are part and parcel of their daily life, so we can use them in L2 so that we can facilitate their process of acquisition. We need to consider the fact that children age 5, 6, or 7 are still acquiring their L1, so there is a lot of vocabulary still to be learned in their first language. But it doesn't mean that they cannot learn a second language simultaneously. They do acquire a lot of vocabulary of L1 and L2 simultaneously, and they don't necessarily need to be the same. So they can acquire many words in L2 which they don't know in L1. And they are acquiring this vocabulary in order to develop a better understanding of the world around them. It is also said that children can develop better pronunciation than older learners because children as young as 5, 6, 7, they have enough flexibility in their brain to learn any new sounds, like babies have the ability to acquire any human sound. So children, the younger a child, the better his or her pronunciation could be. Like L1 speaking children, they also may have difficulty with certain phonemes or sounds. So we need to see in our learners that what difficulty they have in pronouncing some of the English sounds so that we can drill those sounds in order to help them acquire that sound. Considering the fact that children are still acquiring their first language, we need to see how much we can expect from them in an L2. So, for example, how many words can a 5-year-old string together? Probably not too many. In not even in L1. So we need to see what a child can do in her L1 in order to expect something in L2. Also, certain phonemes are difficult to articulate in English. For example, Arabic speakers find it quite difficult to pronounce or to differentiate between pa and ba, pa as in pen, ba as in bank. So we need to see what are these sounds which are difficult for Urdu speakers so that we can help our children with these sounds. At this stage, I'd like you to consider how we can apply this knowledge to the classroom. For example, we have identified some of the phonemes which are difficult for our children. So how can we use this knowledge in the classroom? So continuing with teacher expectations, it is a fact that children overgeneralize grammar rules. Even in their L1, they tend to generalize a lot of grammar rules when they are developing. So the classic example is of verbs which end in ed. So native English speakers tend to add ed with the verbs which do not take an ed in past. So for example, they would say goed, eated, etc. when they are developing. So when this is a fact in first language acquisition, so of course we cannot expect students not to do this in second language acquisition. So these are really minor errors, and as long as the child can communicate, these errors do not matter. Children may also be less prepared for negotiation for meaning. Negotiation for meaning is the process by which two or more interlocutors identify and then attempt to resolve a communication breakdown. So, for example, when we are learning English as adults, we tend to describe something which we don't know the word of. So, we tend to describe it using some other vocabulary words and phrases. So children really don't do this. They are less prepared, so we cannot expect them to do it once a communication is breakdown. So they just give up. They don't try it again. Given all the things which we have just talked about, we need to find ways around them and build our classroom practices so that we can support the acquisition of language, specifically speaking. Classroom routines play an important role in developing speaking habits, and it helps a lot to make students feel comfortable. Not only children but older learners also feel comfortable with routine when they know what's coming up. It sort of has a effective impact on us. So repeated input is really helpful with children because they can mimic it, they can repeat it, they can use it um, to develop their spoken repertoire. Routine may include date. We can start off our classes with telling the day, the date. We can talk about weather, draw pictures of weather. We can observe students' birthdays and teach them related language. Where initially, of course, teacher is going to use all the language associated with these routines. Later on, children are going to pick up. We can greet and ask students to greet each other. We can call the register or assign students to call the register. We can also use the language while we are handing out books and copies, and you must have noticed in your classroom that children are quite curious, and they really want to be helpful and they want to hand out books. So we can teach language like here you go, where is, for example, Sana, is she absent, etc. So it's also important to have a similar format of lesson every day in order to help students with their spoken language. If we are using a textbook, so we can use the similar procedure so that students are comfortable. In classroom, we can use substitution drills, which are drills in which subject and object are given, for example, and students need to select a verb from a set of given verbs, or subject and verb are given, students need to select from a set of objects, any object, and they can chant the response in chorus. We can also make the drills personalized by adding the names of students in the sentences, and of course the dialogues. They are very typical. Role plays with children are very useful. They can do role plays using their puppets. We can ask them to bring their toys and do role plays with them. They are so creative. In fact, some of them have imaginary friends and they talk to themselves. I don't know if you remember or not from your childhood, but we all have imaginary friends when we are very young. So we can ask students to be creative and do role plays with their imaginary friends. Since children are highly imaginative and creative, so to take full advantage of this creative linguistic ability that children have, it is necessary that we put them into situations where the desire to communicate forces them to find some way to express themselves, and we can of course help them. And in the course of this, if they are sort of inventing a few words, so it is okay, because perhaps they are trying to pin down the patterns of language. Children need various activities where real natural use of language occurs as a part of learning, and not only intentional use of language. So we need to engage them in situations which are real, which really push them to create the language and to communicate naturally. Many of you must have found yourself in a situation where children may understand you, but they reply back in L1. So how do you react normally? Or what do you think how you should react? I'd like you to take a moment and think about it. Probably you should accept what the child says. Maybe repeat the child's answer in L2. Never pretend not to understand, because this is very depressing for the child. And encourage repetition, but do not insist it, because the child may not have the necessary linguistic resources to do so. So why are we being so cautious about all these things? Probably because speaking is quite demanding. In fact, more demanding than listening, because in speaking, children have to construct sentences for themselves. Um, so we need to go through meticulous preparation and assessment of activities, because we need to make sure that the language activities which we are assigning students, they should not be above their level. And we are going to look at some of the activities in this presentation. We should also provide all the language and meta language which is necessary, because they do not have any other sources to get that language. Perhaps they don't even have such language in their L1, because when they are quite young, they may not have the vocabulary to talk about some things even in their first language. So we need to provide them all the language which they need while doing a speaking task. And most of all, we should avoid frustration, because young children do not have the capacity to deal with frustration. And when it leads to demotivation, they do not have the concept of motivating themselves, and they do not have the concept of the end goal of whatever we are engaging them in. They could also be bored, and we need to avoid it, because in the worst cases it may lead to discipline problems. So all these demands which we are placing on them, they could be summarized in these 5 types of demands. The first one is, of course, there could be linguistic demand, which means lack of grammatical resources or vocabulary. It could be referential, because in using a language, we refer back to whatever we have said, or we refer to something which is coming up. So the children may not have the necessary resources to do so. There could be cognitive demands, which mean they simply do not understand the concept which is being talked about. There could be metacognitive demands, which means, for example, the students need to monitor their own performance while doing a particular task. And it could be interactional demands, which mean, for example, students do not have the necessary skills to interrupt someone, or to take turns. They simply do not know how to do it. So considering all these demands, I'd like you to think for a moment and think about how might each of these apply to a group of young learners. So let's see what we can learn from the communicative language teaching and apply to teaching speaking for young learners. So classroom language is based on language needed outside the classroom. So this is the key idea of CLT. But young children's language is quite different outside the classroom. So what to do? We can still include some adult roles as an authentic part of child's play, because a lot of time children play, for example, imitating doctors or imitating bankers, going shopping. So they do such role plays with their maybe imaginary friends or real friends. So we can also do ask them to do such role plays in the classroom in L2. We can focus questions, prepositions, and verb forms through these communication activities. With regards to fluency, it's very difficult because young children especially, cannot string together a very long sentence. They do want to express a lot, but they cannot, because of their limited linguistic repertoire, or their acquired language. Here is a whole range of activities which we can use with primary students. So flashcards, they are very versatile. They are good for activities which include accuracy, and they are also good at activities which include fluency. So you can use flashcards with verb forms, with prepositions, with verbs, and as well as for vocabulary. You can also use flashcards for weather, and of course songs, which are very popular and part and parcel of students' day-to-day life. Action songs are also popular with young children. Collaborative storytelling, which means that we also involve students in telling a story rather than we only tell a story. Simple surveys, we can teach question forms through it. Team games, of course we need to be very careful with games, because if we don't have a set rules a set of rules for the game, we can easily lose control of the game. Spot the difference, back-to-back drawing. So these all activities can be used with primary kids. Now we are moving from the primary grades to the secondary school, and we are dealing with mostly teenagers. So we are at this stage, we should consider that they are able to speak English with some fluency. So now we are going to look at why is speaking important, why do we want them to learn to use English, and why are they reluctant to use English. Now we are going to explore these in depth. So why is speaking important? Our L1 is stored in the long-term memory, and we also want our L2 to be stored in the long-term memory. But new information, whatever we listen to in L2, is stored in the short-term memory until it is transferred. So for transferring it to the long-term memory, we need to use it, and the best way to do so is through speaking. Often we translate our L2, or the information which we receive in L2, into L1 to understand it quickly, but this doesn't help brain to transfer L2 into the long-term memory. So we want the students not to do it, and do it less often, and we want them to actually speak in English so that they can help their short-term memory to transfer the information into the long-term memory. Like physical activities, we need the agility of body. We need mental fitness and agility for mental activities. One of the mental activities is language learning and language using. So language learning and maintenance uses a surprising number of muscles. The brain and the more obvious muscles are in the mouth and jaw. It follows logically. The more we exercise it, the easier it is for us to use the second language. But for our teenagers, they do not have much opportunities to practice their language outside the classroom. So if their only opportunity is English class, they need to maximize on the time to exercise. talking about the authenticity of language. Speaking is a way of expressing ourselves in any language, and the most motivating language to learn is the language which enables us to talk in a way which is true to our personality. And that is why we learn our L1 to express our personality. Students also bring their personalities to every class, and their authentic language requirements will become apparent. We need to take into consideration their authentic language requirements, which means we should accept their personalities in terms of the topics which they are interested in, like music, fashion, gossip about personalities, and we should also take into consideration the functions which they use language for. So they could range from exaggerating to exchanging anecdotes. If they do not have the tools to express themselves in English, they will revert back to the tools which they already have, that is their native language, and it becomes a problem in a monolingual classroom where everyone understands the same language, so it's very easy for them to express themselves in their native language, so they revert to their native language quite often. At this stage, we should not accept them to use their first language, because we really want they do have all the language. What they need to learn is to actually use that language. So this is what we are helping them to, and one of the ways of doing it is by engaging them in authentic language use, and accepting their personalities and engaging them in activities which are authentic for them. Let's look at why they don't use English. First reason is the peer pressure. They cannot handle peer pressure, and at the teenage they have a lot of peer pressure. L2 speaking requires students to stand up and make fools of themselves at an age when they are at their most self-conscious. So language using is like making the fools out of themselves for them. This is how they see it. So this is what we need to take into consideration. And there is a lack of motivation. They are not really motivated because teenagers want instant rewards. If they are learning English to pass an exam, this is not motivation in itself, because it will be over and their motivation will also be over. So we need to see and make ways to help them stay motivated. They also don't use English because there is lack of support, classroom atmosphere, and linguistic support is not available. So we need to make our classrooms teenagers friendly so that they can use English. How can we give necessary support for teenagers so that we can help them to learn to use language? It's not realistic to expect teenagers to provide the generous and patient environment for language practice. They are going to taunt, tease, and laugh at each other while language use. So encourage them to support each other, for example, by working in teams, and do some teamwork and team building activities with them. It's useful to provide linguistic support, words and phrases required for the classroom interaction. Classroom language such as "sorry, I'm late, can you repeat that please" is the only English they will use throughout the whole class or the whole year. So, and it is also authentic language which they really need to use it, rather than they are using it for the sake of language activity. So it is useful to capitalize on such language by providing them, or maybe writing such language on big posters and putting them in the classroom so that the students can refer to them when they want to use any phrase and they can't remember. We can also play confidence tricks with them. Maybe we can ask them that this is going to be English only classroom. This is how we are changing the classroom language to English only, and perhaps tricking them into using English. We can try pronunciation games. We can go for drills, and even at teenage they don't particularly object to drills because they feel safer in a crowd, and if they think any sound of English is funny, they'll feel safe saying that sound in the crowd, and it will be amusing for them. We can also choose a buzzword for a class and encourage everyone to use that buzzword. Maybe we can give a reward for using that word. The word could either be very useful or sound a bit strange or be a keyword in the group of vocabulary we have just covered. Um, the use of the word needs to be rewarded so that even weaker students should try to use it, and perhaps we should specifically nudge weaker learners so that they can use that buzzword and participate more in learning the use of English. Okay, so here we have got a list of activities which we can use with teens. Of course, we looked at a different list of activities for primary students that can be applied to teens. Many of them can be used with teenagers, but there are some more ideas to think about. First is problem solving in groups or pairs. Teenagers are really interested in solving problems, and for a moment they can also forget that they are learning a language because they've got a problem to solve. Information gap exercises where one student has certain amount of information and the other student has different information and they want to exchange their information. Interviews, and this goes back to the authenticity which we were talking about. It's related to their personalities, so they are watching television all the time, so television type interviews can really be appealing for them. We can use surveys in the classroom, find someone who activities. We can also use drama, which teenagers are really interested in. Maybe we can ask them to write their own dramas and turn them into a mini theater. And of course, games, which are essential part of language learning. So we can use games which are communicative in nature and which really push them to use real language. So finally, the conclusions of teaching speaking. Young children want to communicate and they want to speak. So we need to create the environment which gives them the opportunity to speak, and this is how they are going to extend their ability to speak. If speech emerges gradually, we just need to create the best environment which is conducive to their acquisition. Chunks, routines, and familiar tasks are quite useful to create an environment which is helpful for second language acquisition. Teenagers may be less willing to speak, so we need to design activities carefully, taking into consideration their personalities. We should also be sensitive to teenagers because of the characteristics which they possess. And finally, the most important thing which we need to remember is that second language acquisition occurs through speaking, not the vice versa. So we are developing speaking by speaking, not that we acquire language and then we start to speak. So the more we speak, the better we can become at speaking in English. Moving on to the task to explore this topic further, you need to complete the reading and answer the questions in the task sheet. Bye for this presentation, and I'll see you in the next presentation with the next skill, that is reading.